Congratulations, you've made it to the final lecture video for U.S. history. In video 2 for Unit 10, we're going to be looking at key events that happened during the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, the country had been going through several years of an economic recession. In order to try to pull the country out of this economic recession, Ronald Reagan implemented a set of changes that have become known as Reaganomics, or sometimes called supply side economics. Reagan believed that the country should cut taxes. This would help with businesses and corporations having more money to invest in growth and hopefully job creation, and also give the American people more money to spend on things. He thought this would help spur economic growth. He also believed that government programs and regulations should be cut. That would help with government spending. It would also help by cutting regulations, making it easier for businesses to grow and expand. Now, the economy did grow when Reagan was president, so we have to give him some credit for that. However, there was also an increase in spending on the military during this time. And since we were bringing in less tax revenue and spending more money, it led to deficits. A deficit, again, is when you spend more than you actually bring in. And over the course of several years, this led to the national debt growing and growing and growing. Reagan believed which two things should be reduced in order to help the economy grow? And why did Reaganomics lead to higher deficits and a higher national debt? Now, one of the key things happening when Reagan was president was the continuation of the Cold War. When Reagan first became president, he was pretty tough towards the Soviet Union and put a lot of pressure on them by modernizing the U.S. military. Of course, the Cold War was a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, so they felt like they had to try to keep up. But after years of a communist economy, the Soviet Union economy was just in a horrific condition in the 1980s, and they found it impossible to try to keep up with this. The new leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, decided to try to make some changes in the Soviet Union in order for them to be able to compete with us. So he started opening up more free market economic principles, kind of like what we do. And he also started easing the controls the government had put on things like freedom of speech and freedom of press. Now, in the second half of Reagan's presidency, he took advantage of these changes happening in the Soviet Union to set a more positive and cooperative tone towards the Soviet Union. And indeed, he and Gorbachev actually met together several times, and the two nations cooperated on new agreements to cut nuclear arms um, and other weapons in what was a new nuclear arms agreement. Now, the changes that Gorbachev made were too little too late, and the Soviet Union began to, these changes started to spin out of control. And by the time we get to the end of the 1980s and the very beginning of the 1990s, the Soviet Union is cracking and eventually falls apart. And the Cold War was over, thankfully, by peaceful means. Now, Reagan gets a lot of credit for helping to end the Cold War by putting pressure on the Soviet Union originally and then working together with Gorbachev in his last years as president. However, we have to give credit to a long line of presidents, all the way from President Truman up through Reagan, that stood the course against communist expansion all throughout the Cold War. How did Reagan put pressure on the USSR at the beginning of his presidency? And how did Reagan work with the Soviet Union later in his presidency? George H.W. Bush became president after Ronald Reagan, and one of the key events that happened while he was president was the Persian Gulf War. Now, this happened because Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, invaded the neighboring country of Kuwait. And there are also concerns that Saddam Hussein might also invade Saudi Arabia. So, President George H.W. Bush helped organize a coalition of many nations from across the world to go in and stop Iraq and to kick them out of Kuwait. The war turned out to be a very easy victory for the United States, and indeed, Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi army was very quickly removed from Kuwait. However, Saddam Hussein was allowed to stay in power, and this led to the United States invading Iraq again about a decade later. What was George H.W. Bush's goal during the Persian Gulf War? In 1992, Bill Clinton defeated George H.W. Bush and became president. One of the key things that Clinton is remembered for is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was a free trade agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. Now, opponents of NAFTA were concerned about this because they were afraid it would, America would lose jobs to Mexico and Canada. And that did happen. But supporters believe that overall it would help us by exposing us to more of the growing Mexican market and by helping Canada, the United States, and Mexico more easily trade with each other, that the economies of all three nations would improve. And that's also true. So the pros and cons of NAFTA are still debated to this very day, but it did help to create this tariff-free free trade zone. And in general, the economies of all three nations have benefited from NAFTA. Bill Clinton also became only the second president in United States history to have impeachment charges brought against him. The first was Andrew Johnson during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. Remember, Nixon resigned before they could impeach him. Clinton was charged with perjury and obstruction of justice because he lied under oath about an affair that he was having with a White House intern. In fact, he said it wasn't true, and it turned out to be true. And so he had lied under oath. When the trial came up and the Senate was deciding on whether or not to kick Clinton out of office or not, they decided to acquit him. Acquittal means not found guilty, or in this case, not removed from office. Which three nations were part of NAFTA and why was it created? Why was Bill Clinton impeached? And what was the result of his impeachment trial? September 11th, 2001 was one of the most horrific days in American history when a terrorist organization called Al Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, attacked the World Trade Center in New York City, the Pentagon near Washington, D.C., and also had plans of using a fourth plane to probably attack another place in Washington, D.C., but that plane was brought down by passengers on board before it actually made it to the destination the terrorists had intended. The War on Terror, as President George W. Bush called it, began in October of 2001. George W. Bush is the son of George H.W. Bush. He authorized an invasion of Afghanistan because the Taliban, the leaders of Afghanistan, were harboring the Al Qaeda network. Indeed, Osama bin Laden was operating out of Afghanistan when the September 11th attacks happened. The United States quickly broke up the Al Qaeda network in Afghanistan. However, Osama bin Laden was able to escape and remained on the run for over a decade before he was finally killed by American troops in 2011. Another part of the war on terror that was not directly tied into the September 11th attacks was the United States invasion of Iraq in March of 2003. Now, this had nothing to do directly with the September 11th attacks, but we were concerned in the war on terror that Saddam Hussein had bad intentions and that he had weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction are things like chemical warfare or nuclear weapons that can kill many, many people at once. And indeed, Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons against his own people. He refused to allow United Nations inspectors to continue to come into his country to investigate whether or not he had these or not. So most people around the world assumed he did. When we invaded Iraq, though, very little evidence of weapons of mass destruction was actually discovered. However, Saddam Hussein himself was eventually captured and turned over to the Iraqi people. He was put on trial for all the crimes he had committed and all the murders he had committed as leader of Iraq, and eventually was executed by his own people in 2006. Which group was responsible for the 9/11 attacks? Why did we invade Afghanistan as part of the war on terror? And why did we invade Iraq as part of the war on terror? Now, the fears that were very real after the 9/11 attacks of another possible attack led to the Patriot Act. And indeed, there's always groups that would attack the United States if they had the opportunity. So we have to be vigilant against threats. George W. Bush signed a law called the Patriot Act that gave law enforcement agencies the power to search private communications and personal records. Now, this was done with good intentions to protect the American people, but as time has gone on, people have started to be a little suspicious of the Patriot Act, and it brought up concerns about the government having the right to invade our privacy. And even though the original Patriot Act was set up for good intentions, could the government use this power for bad intentions? So there's this ongoing debate in America about the question between how much of our rights should we give up to be secure versus how much should we risk, our safety in order to be free. And that will always be an ongoing debate. Where do we draw the line between security and freedom? Why was the Patriot Act created and why was it controversial? The 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s were dominated by very quick and rapid changes in the realm of technology, especially when it came to communications and the computer. The personal computer started to become a big deal in the 1970s, 80s. The idea of somebody having their own computer at home would have been unthought of, unbelievable in the 1960s and early 70s. But by the time we get to the late 80s and early 90s, many people had their own personal computers. Now, this was great for people at home, but for businesses, it also made things so much easier. Record keeping, inventory, communication between um, different stores and warehouses and so forth were is greatly increased by this. And then in the early 90s, when the internet came out, this made it even better. You think about today how much we do on the internet and how much business is done through the internet. These innovations have greatly increased productivity, speed, and efficiency in the business world. And also, as far as personal communications go, we can now use the internet, social media, cell phones, and smartphones to do all kinds of things that people would have thought were impossible. You could have a business meeting on a live video today with a company from China, and such things would have just been considered science fiction just a couple decades ago. What are some of the ways that personal computers, internet, and social media have impacted society and the economy? Finally, we're going to look at the historic election of 2008. Now, this was a hotly contested election between Barack Obama and John McCain. Barack Obama ended up winning this election and becoming president of the United States. Now, the historical significance of this is he became the first person of color to be elected president. If you think about the fact that just a few decades earlier, in parts of the country, people couldn't vote or even go to the same restaurants and restrooms with each other, it's quite amazing here in 2008 we have a person of color elected president. So, for all the horrible things that happened with racism leading up to the civil rights movement and the changes of the early 1960s, it's does speak positively of America that just a few decades later, we actually have somebody sitting in the White House who just a few decades earlier wouldn't have been able even to sit in the same restaurant with people of a different color. What was the historical significance of the 2008 election?